Hi, Santiago. Good to see you again.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you, Maiko.
Hi. ChangeNOW obviously being really the mecca for impact, I would say. Every year, huge event in Paris with over 30,000 people joining every year. So you should definitely make sure to sign up for next year's edition. You can already pre-register on the ChangeNOW website. And I've been very impressed always with ChangeNOW, really bringing all kinds of groups in society together: policymakers, activists, innovators, corporates, you name it. You just hosted a career fair for people that want to get into climate. So you're basically helping anyone to be part of the solution, not just to climate change, but to some of the biggest social and environmental problems out there. So welcome, good to have you. Next up, we have Tomer Shalit. He's the co-founder and CPO of ClimateView. Hey, Tomer. Good to see you again. It's good to have you back. We recorded a podcast a few years ago, and I think we realized the team was between 5 to 10 people then, and you grew quite a bit since then, right? So what did you say, 60 plus people now at ClimateView?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, super exciting to have you back. And ClimateView is really a great case study for a platform that helps cities specifically with actually translating their commitments to be part of the solution to climate change to actual action, translate it down and break it down into concrete roadmaps and show their citizens as well what they're doing. We'll learn about that in a second. And last but not least, I welcome Louis Jamart. He's heading climate at Public. Public is an amazing GovTech organization. So a GovTech organization, they are hosting the GovTech Summit. Actually, you're kind of in the middle of hosting that right now, isn't it? In The Hague. So anybody in the GovTech space, do check out Public. But Public does more than that. They do a range of different programs, innovation programs, all between government and innovation. So excited to have you join us, Louis. So I want to go on a quick round for everyone to just introduce your work a little bit more beyond what I just said. And what is your perspective on bringing activists, policymakers, and innovators together through the work that you do? Let's start with you, Santiago.
Thank you, Maiko. Well, ChangeNOW, as you said, is a global event that we organize every year. It's something that we created next to just a year after the COP in Paris, where actually the vision was that we were reaching historical agreements there in Paris. And yet the question of the how can we get to those agreements and reach those targets? This question of the how was here and without any response. And at ChangeNOW we said, okay, what would happen if we gather all those who do, all the innovators, corporates, all the private sector, put together also the talent, the media, the policymakers, and we create a space where we not discuss and debate about how many, when, how much, but really about the how, only the how. And this is what we try to do. Bring as many people as possible on board around the table to have this kind of discussion and even more collaboration.
Amazing. Over to Tomer. Go ahead, if you give us a quick intro on how you're part of the solution.
You asked about sort of policymakers and activists, but I think one very interesting thing with this space is that policymakers can actually be activists. A policymaker working for government or the city, they abide to the laws and they do their job as the job description is done. But they will take as much, when it comes to climate change, they will actually stretch their boundaries as far as they possibly can. So what we have done with ClimateView is actually get at a very early stage, even when we're basically this was a prototype and big poster. We got government agencies to high level working with corporates, working with cities, to work together with defining the goals. Basically, what we did with the tool then was take the big climate transition of Sweden and break it down into small manageable pieces that can be measured. How this was a big thing, like taking thousands of pages of government documents and things like this, and then breaking it down to clear KPIs. And doing that by helping people to work together, by breaking down a big goal into smaller pieces, and then making those pieces measurable, and then seeing, are we doing enough to reach that goal? Now, this is standard business practice in any other business, of course, but trying to do it, and the difference in climate is that it's so overreaching, it's so complex, there's so many things, you have to take a pretty big approach. But we did that by getting them to work together and all the time trying to find measurable pieces and identify them. I was saying, like, going back to a reflection is that policymakers are actually activists if you treat them the right way, and we can make the system work much faster if you sort of dare take both approaches.
Amazing. Thank you. And Louis, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Maiko, and thank you so much for having me join the session today. I think it's such a fantastic topic, and it's just so interesting to hear about ClimateView and ChangeNOW and what you're doing in this space as well. So I work for a company called Public, as Maiko, you said. It's a GovTech organization, which is, I guess, slightly different to a lot of the climate tech organizations here. Public actually started life about 5 years ago as an accelerator to help startups to sell their solutions into government. And at the time, climate wasn't one of the topics that they were focused on, because the idea was that climate wasn't a GovTech issue. But it's actually come a long way since then. And, you know, there are so many targets out there for government these days that we've really integrated climate into the work that we do. And it's essential that technology plays a role in how governments are tackling the climate crisis. And so there's a range of work that we do in this space. It includes running our own campaigns and events like Tech for Our Planet, which we ran in partnership with the UK Cabinet Office at COP26 last year. And that brought investors, innovators and policymakers together around solutions to 5 different challenges that they were trying to address, and enable them to showcase their solutions in the green zone at COP, to trying to bridge that gap, which is often seen between the policymakers and the innovators. But we also do work supporting local authorities to understand what their key strategies are and how they can translate their strategy and their targets into action through the technology that is already available on the market. So rather than creating new technology themselves, understanding what are the use cases for technology that would enable them to deliver upon the targets that they've set themselves, and what is most appropriate for what they need. And then the final area for us, and the key area in this space, is climate tech has and the incredible advantage of being able to have impact across the board, not just on climate change, but when we're talking about policy, climate interventions and technological interventions can also impact health, they can impact defense, they can impact a whole range of different policy topics. And so working across the board, trying to understand how can we use that technology, support governments to use that technology to address multiple policy challenges at once, and use that as the leverage to progress policy in all those directions.
Got it. Got a question for everyone, but maybe I want to start with Tomer on this one, and I'm sure everybody can chip in on that one. You know, Tomer, you mentioned that there is actually an overlap. These are not necessarily separate groups. There can be real activists in government. Obviously, innovators can be activists, and I would consider everybody on screen a form of activist as well as an innovator. So there is definitely an overlap. But if we take it very practical, and if you look at these activists within these local governments that you're working with, there seems to be people that are really willing to take action, implement stuff. Yet it's still really difficult to make things happen. And I know, especially in the early days of ClimateView, you had to do a lot of hands-on work to really get the ball rolling. What makes it so difficult for policymakers to take action, and how can we help as innovators and people in society?
Well, first of all, we have to remember this is probably the biggest societal change that ever needed to happen. And there is friction. We have winners and losers. We can talk all about the transition as a good thing, and we know it's better planet and better health and all that. So everyone around here knows that, but there are also losers. So there's a reason it's hard, because it is hard. It is a lot. So let's not just say, oh, it could be simple to solve. So And also it's very, very cross-disciplinary, as everyone will know. It has to, and also we have to make a plan where we don't know all the parts. It has to be, I mean, we don't have this answer to everything, but we don't have enough time to figure out the answer to everything. We have to march in the right direction. So that's why it's hard. And the way to get across that is, of course, the usual thing of breaking it down to small enough pieces, making sure that you can march in the right direction without, even if you have your goal, you might not see every step, make that possible. One of the most sort of single things that we're beginning to learn now when working with cities is to try, so really seeing the city strategists, we have to make them supermen. They really have to work, we have to empower them to work across all the city boundaries with all, and to give them the best possible holistic picture of the full cost and benefits of the transition, and take it down to money and cost as benefit of the transition, the winners and losers of the stakeholders, and really make that map as clear as possible. Then they'll start having the map to what to do about it. And I think it's really daring to take this holistic picture, which we need to help them with. That's how we can make things move faster.
Maiko, if I could just pick up on that, because I really liked what you said there, Tomer, about breaking it into those small pieces. And I think one of the biggest challenges is, climate is such a buzzword these days that when you mention it, everyone's talking about different things. And when we talk about the gap between policymakers and activists, again, it's the same thing, right? That we're treating these as homogenous groups, but actually everyone's in a very different situation. And so I think for me, linked to that, one of the key things is the language that's used and being very specific about the language that's used in this space. And I think the more we can do that to align the high level language used by the policymakers with the language that's being used by innovators and activists as well, and being really specific about what we mean and what we're talking about and what we're trying to address, the faster we can kind of generate action. And I think we saw that with COVID from a healthcare perspective. There was something very specific that policy needed to tackle, and that was the fastest policy response. You could argue it wasn't fast enough, but it was still the fastest policy response that we've seen. And we did programs with government where they launched a challenge innovation program in 6 weeks, which they had never done before. And so I think when you can get to a very specific problem that you're trying to solve, actually you can start moving that forward together. And I think part of the challenge at the moment is this kind of climate crisis, big issue that we're trying to tackle, without breaking it into those pieces and making sure we're speaking that same language as Tomer was saying.
Santiago, what's your take on this?
Well, I think that, as Louis and Tomer say, the climate change is such a big topic that we need to really win a battle one after each other. And on our side, how we manage to see this also is that if I simplify the way we can see the world, is that we have three big parts playing together, and not always playing together. The real point is that if we manage to align those three parts, we really make big steps forward. You have on one part the citizens and the activists saying to governments and policymakers, we want to change this or we want to change that. Okay, policymakers usually are good people and they would be very happy to go in that direction. But they also know sometimes that if they make a change, this can really have, as Tomer says, there are some losers. And we can't just change things without really having a good alternative that will be socially acceptable. And for me, this is where entrepreneurs and companies also often come into the equation, is that they come with new models, new values or value creation processes that enable to give to the politics the way to say, okay, we can change the laws because we have now something credible in terms of alternative. And this is something we see pretty often at ChangeNOW. And I can give you just one or two examples like that, but there is one about microplastics. You have a lot of people saying, okay, there are too many plastic in the sea, what can we do, etc. The government in France was really looking a way to put a law to stop and to reduce microplastics, meaning that they wanted to put a law on the new laundering machines, saying each laundry sends a lot of millions of microparticles of plastics into the sea. How can we stop that? At ChangeNOW, they met a Slovenian startup, Planet Care, which was creating those filters for microplastics. And so they met there. 1 week later, they created a gathering of all the industry players saying, look, we spotted this. You can't say that this is not possible. Now, starting from 2025, all the new laundering machines will have to have this kind of technology. And this is an example of how the three really work together towards a goal.
Such a good case study there. Louis and Tomer, you have some case studies probably as well on successful collaboration. Who wants to go first and sharing a bit more on what does good look like in terms of innovator, policymaker, activist collaboration? Whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Go ahead, Louis.
Sure. Well, I think it's very similar. I really like what you're saying, Santiago, there, because I think for me, a big thing here is this policy to product cycle, which is we often talk about how do you translate your policy, your regulation into a product at the end. But also there's something really big about how do you go from your product and use that product as inspiration to then move the policy. And often, the products move much faster than the policy behind it. So for us, there is several different examples that we use through our work, and we do many programs in this space. But one of the really exciting ones, as I mentioned, was during COVID before. So during COVID, everyone was panicked. We worked with the National Health Service in the UK, and they actually said to us from a healthcare perspective, which is a very similar problem, how can we make this change happen really quickly, and how can we get the innovation to solve the problems that we're facing? So we worked with the policymakers at the time to set up a program where they set out a series of different challenges that they were facing relating to the most vulnerable communities who couldn't access the care services that they needed. And we used that through those kind of that setup to launch that challenge program and find and roll out in 6 weeks a series of different solutions that had never been on the market before that were addressing the challenges that were out there. And so I think there's a lot that climate can learn from other sectors which have gone through this space as well, which are trying to make that policy to product move. I think that combination of thinking through giving exposure to products for the policymakers so that policymakers can see the products that are out there, but also helping them to understand how do you work from a starting point, which is your policy challenge, to quickly roll out a solution in an agile way is really important. And there is more and more demand in that space and more of an interest. And I think that's really supported by the fact going forward that for climate space, at least, every single policymaker is going to need to be a climate expert, whether that is your climate team within government, or if that's your CIO or your chief digital officer. They will all need to have an understanding of climate. And I think that will really enable them to start thinking about this in a more kind of holistic, systemic way, rather than from a single kind of perspective as well.
Got it, Tomer.
Well, I mean, our platform is what we're calling it. It's about giving insights and decision intelligence. So basically showing the problem so that then good innovations can come. So I'll give an example, because it's one of the first ones where we sort of change the policies going to be made. And then I think this would be a good mapping where we would be able to spot innovations. It started with the city of Umeå, where just now is a really good cycling city. People are cycling a lot, and we're very proud of the cycle strategy. And then part of the climate action plan was more cycle paths and even better cycle strategy. But then when breaking down into small pieces in the KPI, it actually turns out that that's very good, but it's more interesting to look at the villages around this city, and then maybe say 10,000 people commuting by car, each in their own car. And even if we're just looking at 5,000 people, the impact of a couple of buses, although it addresses many fewer people, gave a much higher impact on climate than making an even better cycle network, although it's everyone's pet project because we're proud of our cycle networks. Now, that's one of those examples where, okay, understanding exactly where the impact is, then identifies a different solution to the problem. And obviously here would be a space where, oh, well, if we had some electric bus company, which we also happen to have, then this situation would be spotted. So I think, as like with always with innovation, a very clear description of the problem will then make other things be able to jump up. So yeah, that's one example, like being really clear about what problem you're trying to solve, opening the space for innovations that way.
Got it. Well, we are called Climate Tech Founder Summit because the majority of our audience is actually founders or aspiring founders. So I'd love to extract some takeaways for founders as well. There's many of us that are actually selling to government or partnering with government, and that would like to learn from your experience and from your work on how to make that happen. Obviously, in the early stages of running a startup, it can be quite daunting to try to do anything with government, and it can potentially kill you, as can corporate partnerships if you don't do it carefully, because timelines can just take a long time. And I'd like to ask each of you to share like some advice on what you would recommend to early stage startups that want to collaborate with government, want to sell into government, partner with government. What's the best thing they can do to optimize for success, and maybe some mistakes to avoid from your own experience? Who wants to go first?
Well, I can go.
It seems like it relates a lot to the early days of ClimateView, right?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I did. The introduction I did was actually identify the fact that so many of these high-level officials, policymakers, approach them as people. I mean, remember, we're in the climate space, everyone wants you to win. This is not like any other business I've ever done before. Everyone wants you to succeed. So, I mean, literally our first pitch was gate crashing an event, rolling out an MVP in front of a minister. Good story, but because this could never have happened in any other space. The kind of collaborations we got happening very, very fast was then you did the usual thing you need to do of making sure you have a small project to make it sellable and all that stuff. That the tricks of the trade that you need to have, but remember that people are actually willing to walk that extra step to make it happen. And believe in the good of people in that sense. That's a really glass half full attitude.
Is there anything you can do in the early days? Is it just you got to be lean and be realistic on the timelines there? I mean, approaching them as people is great, but then if to actually get a project off the ground or start selling to them, if you have to wait 6 months to 12 months or so to actually get in there, what would you recommend to founders in the early days to manage that risk?
It's the usual thing of a compelling event or something like that. In the case of Sweden, we have a big political show happening every year in June, which was Almedalen. Everyone wants something to happen there. In that case, was like, let's do something in 6 months. But this, I would say, this is classic sales. Any lean startup book will say these things. It's just that you remember to use the extra oomph you have of doing something that touches people on a personal level as well.
Got it. Who wants to go next on that? Louis, you were nodding. So
yeah, very happy to go next. Look, I completely agree, and unfortunately, I can't speak to it as a founder myself. But we do a lot of work, and our whole kind of raison d'être is to help startups to sell into government. So hopefully, there's some value I can add through our own experience there. I think for me, there's three main things. One of the big ones is understanding where government is coming from and where policy is coming from. I know depending on the market that you're going into, the need when we're working in the climate tech space is going to be very different, and it comes back to that language. And so we've worked with different startups with VCs trying to sell into emerging markets with a really fantastic air pollution solution, for instance, or air pollution monitoring. And then they'll go into that market, try to pitch that, and then the policymakers there aren't actually worried about the climate impacts of that. But had they pitched it more as a health solution with the health benefits of it, they may have received a lot more traction. So understanding what the policy imperatives are in the area that you're pitching from a policy perspective is really important, because it can help you show those co-benefits of your technology and land it with the right people. I think another thing here is really understanding the procurement cycle. And so we do a lot of work with government procurement and the business systems. As you say, the timelines are very, very long. And so making sure that as soon as possible, you're on the right frameworks for the country or the location that you're in, that you understand what questions are going to be asked and the way that those questions are going to be asked is super important to make sure that when the time comes around, actually you can tick all the important boxes quickly, and you can really focus your time on the answers, which can be quite time consuming at the end. And I think the final thing to link to all this is it's really hard to win or to sell cold into government. And so as Toma was saying, to go to the events. You know, you mentioned before, Public hold the GovTech Summit every year. We've just finished this year actually, but the next one is 12 months from now. And if people are interested, it's a great place to come for this kind of thing. Lots of policymakers. I know that ChangeNOW will have the same thing, and a huge event with lots of policymakers there as well. So those kinds of events where you get exposure is brilliant. And the key thing I think in those initial conversations is a lot of the government partners that we work with really like to start with their pilot. So rather than trying to sell the big solution in the end, actually starting with a pilot and being able to demonstrate how you've done it with a different government partner somewhere else. So if you start local small and you can demonstrate that to another government partner, it really helps build that traction and that network. So just from the work that we've done, I think those are three kind of really key areas that will come together, but it's never simple selling to government.
Yeah, if I can jump on this one as well. Well, I will just talk about my experience. I do not come at all from the political landscape, so I don't have a lot of experience in the field. But as an entrepreneur, actually, I discovered two things there. The first one is that you will have a lot of support and traction in at the government level if you match the political agenda. That's the first thing. If you are not matching the political agenda, it will be very difficult to attract policymakers. Unless you manage to make something really significant. And so that means that at some point you also need to really first, I guess, and that's what we've done, you stay focused on your mission. You try to grow your activity to be really an expert, and then you start to be significant so you can reach to the policymakers. But for me, it's either one or the other, but we spent a lot of time at the beginning to try to convince policymakers. That came a bit later, actually. And we also had to invest in someone who really put a lot of time into the public relations. Otherwise, as a founder, you have a lot of other things to do, and you don't put enough time to keep the relationship, to push forward the different agendas. So this is maybe the advice I can give. And one last thing is also that you can definitely have, maybe you can reach also to other governments directly. This works also sometimes, that you may have more traction abroad than in your own country and your own government. So don't be afraid to try this also.
Some really good lessons there. We get some questions from the audience. If anybody in the audience wants to submit questions, you can use the Q&A feature or just put it in the chat as well, no problem. But yeah, the Q&A feature is usually the best. We can't always answer all questions, but I'll try to bring up a few here. So we got a question that's, zooming out a little bit. We got quite technical here now, but zooming out a bit from Aaron. How much of climate finance is driven at its core by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? So how much of climate finance money coming into this ecosystem now is driven by the SDGs? What's your view on that? Like, what's the role of the SDGs in general for our space? Tomer, go ahead.
Oh, well, I think the SDGs as a framework that sort of helps, but it's at too high level for climate finance. They want way more detail. So nearly all climate finance as he refers to the development goals. So there's going like saying we're doing this because of that. But I would say that I think there are many opinions on this because this is an evolving field. So whatever I say, I have another opinion. But I think the market is heading towards more detailed impact metrics. Not enough to just check in the boxes and saying we're fulfilling 13 and 17 or whatever. But you really like, what's the impact? And I think and hope that's where climate finance is heading. Otherwise, it's going to be too fluffy.
Santiago.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that definitely there is a real shift in finance. And that's good. I mentioned this because this is also for me linked to what we have as a big topic in this discussion, is that actually we need everyone to be around the table to make things move forward. And so finance is definitely now something pretty significant in this ecosystem. We saw this happen definitely during the along the different editions of ChangeNOW. At the really beginning, we just had like the impact investors from the beginnings. Now we really have big investment funds participating every year, and there are hundreds of them participating at ChangeNOW. So really, we saw this shift. One last thing also I want to say here is that at ChangeNOW, we managed to have finance at the same time as we have activists joining there, and we have policymakers and corporates and everything. And I think that's super important to always try to create those kind of spaces where people talk to each other. Because as you mentioned, Maiko, the polarization is something pretty strong right now. And I think this will be one of the big challenges we'll have to overcome, because polarization can also happen inside of those who want change. And if we go divided, we won't have what we want at the end. So this is for me something super important. We have to stick together and understand the mission of each one and each other.
So important. I think that's kind of one of the risks. I think actually those that want to see real climate action not collaborating enough between all these spaces. Anything to add, Louis, before we wrap up?
Very much agree with my two fellow panelists. I think just to add what I've seen a trend recently, and I'm sure it's the same every year, but when COP comes around, COP has a huge, depending on the direction that COP is going, and the perspective and view that gets on the world stage can really influence climate finance. And I think definitely with the VCs, climate VCs that we work with, there's been a move towards adaptation. And thinking about it really in terms of mitigation and adaptation, and how do we start moving that direction. And I think that's been strongly pushed by COP. I think there's been a huge amount of interest in the Africa and MENA region over the last few years, again, pushed by the global policy priorities. And so I think, clearly lots of different frameworks have a role to play, but I think alongside the SDGs, definitely worth monitoring the direction of global policies and international fora and what they're prioritizing, because I think that influences a lot of the direction of finance as well.
Got it. Thank you so much all for joining. I encourage everybody in the audience to check out all your organizations. Public is public.io, I believe. ChangeNOW, you can already pre-register for next year, changenow.world. And then we got ClimateView.global, I believe. So check out the websites, make sure you engage. And we will be right back in just a couple of minutes. We'll give you a few minutes break before we kick off the next session. And I'm really excited for that one. It is a fireside chat between Levebvre van der Zee, who works with Elemental, and Terrafarm will be right back. So really excited for that one. And see you very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.